All right. So Congressman Bob Good represents Virginia's 5th Congressional District. I believe I mentioned this the last time I had the honor of introducing Congressman Good as well. It's one of the most beautiful parts of my home state of Virginia. So if you ever get the chance to go down to Nelson County in the 5th District, I encourage you to do so. I'm quickly becoming a great tourism advocate for the 5th District as well here. Representative Good has represented that district since January of 2021, and he is a fierce advocate for the foundational principles that have and will continue to make America the greatest nation in history, which in the realm of foreign policy, as we've heard earlier today, and as George Washington's farewell address makes clear, is one of realism and restraint. We're honored to have him join us here today. Please join me in welcoming Representative Bob Good.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you guys today. And what's the old saying? The mind can only absorb what the seat can tolerate. So I know you guys have been sitting and listening for a little bit. So thanks for letting me share a few remarks. I'm going to try to keep my phone prominent here to make sure I respect my colleagues and appreciate the handoff from my very good friend and the very talented and courageous warrior, Dan Bishop. He is certainly one of the finest we have here in Washington. You know, and again, I appreciate the American Conservative for having me and for you all being here today and part of this. And I'm not on a committee that deals directly with these issues. I'm on budget and I'm on education and workforce. Of course, I'm part of the Freedom Caucus, as well as the Border Caucus and the Pro-Life Caucus and some other things. But I may conclude my remarks, if I get to the conclusion, with the fact that while we spend most of our time in our country, most people do, talking about domestic issues, when you have a foreign affairs crisis, a national security crisis, everybody is reminded about what the number one responsibility and role of the federal government is, which is the safety and security of its citizens. Part of that to protect our constitutional liberties, by the way, but also to protect us from foreign invasion and to ensure that we have a strong national defense. It's right there in the preamble to the Constitution. America, I think we all would agree, or at least probably everyone in this room and maybe half of the folks who are elected here in Washington, that America is uniquely blessed. And America has uniquely been a blessing around the world. And I would submit to you that never in the history of the world before this country has the world's economic and military superpower used it for good, used it to expand freedom around the globe as opposed to conquering other nations. Think about the previous world superpowers and how many of them have used that power for good. Fact is, no nation in the history of the world has freed more people, rescued more people, ministered to more people, fed more people, evangelized more people than the United States of America. And that's something that's lost a lot in our culture today and a lot in our conversations today, certainly a lot in our academic situations today, is that America is the most generous and benevolent nation in the history of the world. We are currently and historically the most welcoming nation in the history of the world to people from all races, all ethnicities, all backgrounds, all nationalities into our country. America welcomes some 1 million legal immigrants a year. Now, we are a nation of immigrants, and we're the most welcoming nation in the world to immigrants legally. And yet, we are still the nation for which there's some 300,000 illegals essentially breaking into our country every month. Because they want, most of them, they want what this country has to offer. And by the way, this nation, which is disparaged, again, by half of the elected officials in this Capitol complex, disparaged that we're somehow a systemically racist nation. You know, when people come from all over the world, again, all races, all ethnicities, all nationalities, into our country illegally, they don't phone back home and say, don't come here, it's a racist, institutionally racist, systemically racist country. They don't say that. They said, y'all come. Y'all come because the Biden-facilitated border evasion is live and well, is living and well. And and that's because, again, so many want to come from around the world, and you can recognize, it's almost like the bank robber. We know why he's robbing the bank, because that's where the money is. Maybe he's robbing the bank because he's trying to feed his family. That doesn't make it right. It's still illegal, still breaking the law. So we can understand what the draw here is to this country without, of course, condoning or tolerating those who break the law to do what they're trying to do to get into our country. You know, and the part of that is because no nation, again, in the history of the world, has provided more upward mobility opportunity, again, to people of all races, all ethnicities, all nationalities. Where else on the planet has a minority risen to the highest level of the land, been elected to the presidency? Where has that happened? And I would submit reelected, despite doing a terrible job, because the country didn't care. The country didn't care what the person looked like or what the racial background is. He was voted in because people agreed with his policies, I suppose. And again, just setting foreign policy, what nation in the history of the world, who didn't invent slavery, by the way, despite what we are told by some, again, in this Capitol complex, but what nation in the history of the world has went to war with itself at great loss of blood and treasure, some 600,000 lives, predominantly of the majority population, to free the minority population 74 years after we became a country? That's who America is. That's what America is. And I happen to have a biblical worldview. I'm a born-again Christian. My faith is the most important thing in my life. You know, when I first ran in 2020, started the race in 19, but ran for Congress for the first time, I identified as a biblical and constitutional conservative. A lot of people didn't like either one of those. They particularly didn't like the biblical one. But if you have a biblical worldview, as I do, there is no biblical covenant, contract, or guarantee for America. America's future is what we make it. Search the scriptures. If you do, I certainly do, and you will find, in my view, I don't know how you interpret it, no reference to the United States. So our future, our history, our future history is what we make of it. And I will read one quote today. It's a famous one you've probably heard. But Ronald Reagan said, and this was in 1961. This was 15 years before he ran for the presidency. 1961. Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-fought lessons of how they, in their lifetime, must do the same. See, a lot of young people in there. You will have the same responsibility my generation has that we may be forfeiting to some degree today. He continues, and if you and I don't do this, then you and I may well spend our sunset years telling our children, our children's children, what it once was like in America when men were free. And I can tell you, just even 5 years ago, maybe just 3 years ago, that sounded a lot more like hyperbole to people than it does today. And this is a foreign policy discussion, not a domestic policy discussion. But the world looks to America to be the leader spiritually, morally, diplomatically, and fiscally. You know, there's no plan B. There really is no plan B. You know, George, I think it was H.W. Bush who called us the shining city on a hill. You know, there's no plan B. That said, a couple of thoughts just generally on sort of our outlook on the world and what I think should influence our foreign policy to some degree. Foreign aid, when it comes to foreign aid, you know, we should not be the world's policeman. We should not be the world's nation builder. I think we learned some tough lessons to that effect over the last 20 years. We also should not be the world's welfare provider. We can't afford, setting aside the fact that we should not do it anyway, even if we could afford it, but we can't afford to continue to borrow, to give money to other nations. We should strategically sell or lend resources when it's in our national security interests. I often will say in remarks that I was not elected the 5th District Representative of Ukraine or of Mexico or wherever you say, but I'm the 5th District Representative of Virginia. And by the way, some of the things when it comes to foreign policy, again, as a believer, sometimes I'll hear Christian brothers and sisters try to apply biblical truth that is intended for how I am supposed to live my life as an individual, and I fall short, to be our foreign policy. I'll illustrate that. The Bible says turn the other cheek. I do not want that to be our foreign policy. And I don't believe that's what Jesus was speaking to when he said that. We cannot make other nations become like us. Setting aside the fact that I would argue that we should not. That's not our to make other nations become like us. But when we have tried that, if you have the absence of a respect for the rule of law, you can't build something like America. An absence for the value of life as preeminent. You know, you don't have a constitutional republic that we are. You don't have and as much as the left would like to separate us from this, the foundation for us is our Judeo-Christian principles we were founded upon. And any honest reading of the Constitution, our founding documents, confirms that to be the case. Other nations have to take responsibility for their national defense. Our previous president certainly understood that, perhaps like no president, certainly in modern times. But the danger that, isn't it incredible, by the way, in 2.5 years, how much harm you can do to America's respect on the national stage? How much harm you can do to our military in 2.5 years? How we have weakened, wussified, and wokeified our own military? You know, we kick. I said this. I had lunch with a fellow today that just a friend, constituent, had come up to see me, and I said to him, "Think about just the vaccine mandate on the military. If you had to decide to go to battle with one of two groups of people, I'm not disparaging anyone who didn't get the vaccine in here, but you had to go to battle with one of two groups of people, and you had to go to battle with folks who were complicit and compliant, got told to get the vaccine, and just got the vaccine, or you had to go to battle with those who said, screw that, I'm not doing that. I'm freedom. I own autonomy for my medical decisions. I'm not getting the vaccine." Which one do you want to get in the foxhole with? Which one do you want to fight with? And which one have we kicked out of the military? Which one have we said we do not want at a time we're not meeting our recruitment goals for our branches? And the Biden administration, again, has weakened the stature of the United States in an ever-changing world that much of which only respects power. This place where we find ourselves today, where I go to work every day, is a place of power and persuasion, and primarily it's power. And on the world stage, our adversaries only respect power. And obviously this president doesn't understand that. This is a president who, by the way, told our military the two greatest threats to the country were what? He told this to the military, mind you. Climate and racism in the military. That's what they're focused on. Is it any wonder that our military has been tremendously weakened? And when you talk to those who are in positions of knowledge and expertise, they are not very encouraging what they have to say about the state of our military and the readiness and effectiveness and ability that we have to do what we would need to do if called upon in a crisis. And this is nothing we spend our military resources on should have anything to do with anything but lethality. Make us the strongest, toughest, baddest fighting machine so that nobody wants to take us home. So that we're well equipped to avoid and then, when necessary, to win a war. But look at what's the legacy of the current administration, the debacle in Afghanistan, after he promised us this would not be like other such. This would not be a Saigon moment. And yet we saw what happened with Afghanistan, where, by the way, not only the disastrous withdrawal, not only the loss of life of those 13 courageous warriors, not only the tens of billions of dollars of assets left behind to be used who knows where by who knows whom against us, depleting our own resources, not to mention allies left behind, Americans left behind. But, is this any surprise, 200,000 Afghanis, poorly, if at all, vetted, brought into the country during the two-week rush to the airport. The word in Afghanistan was, you want to get to the U.S., just get to the airport. Get to the airport. And they have slowly begun to admit what we knew. They did not vet these 200,000 individuals. I went to visit some of them shortly thereafter in what was then just outside my district, now it's in my district, Fort Pickett, Blackstone, Virginia, Nottoway County. And I don't know if anyone knows where that is, but I went to Fort Pickett to see there were 6,000 Afghanis housed there right after the withdrawal. Now remember, what was the justification we were told on why we were bringing Afghanis to our country? They were the ones who were the what? Somebody say it. The interpreters, right? The translators. One might think that to be an interpreter or translator, you might need to speak what? So as I moved through the base, I went through they told me not to come, by the way. We have among our district team a former Marine. There's no such thing, so forgive me for saying that to my Marine friends, but someone who served the Marine Corps and state trooper as well, and he's one of my district field reps. And he and I went to get, when we first tried to schedule it, they told us they didn't want us to come. By the way, they let Miss Abigail Spanberger come, And she gave a very different report than I did. They welcomed her, but we said, we're coming. So then they gave us the official tour. After the official tour was over, we wandered through the base ourselves and gave ourselves a tour and began to interact with dozens of the thousands that were housed there, and almost none of them spoke English. Predominantly grown males, almost none of whom spoke English. Now, out of 200,000, Afghanis quickly rushed out, poorly if vetted at all. What percentage would you place upon those who might be questionable actors that could pose harm to the country? 1%? So you think there's only 200? 10%? There's 2,000? Actually, my math's wrong. 1% would be 2,000. 10%, 20,000. What would that be? And by the way, right before the fall in Afghanistan, the withdrawal, what flag were we flying over our embassy in Afghanistan for 30 days? The gay pride flag. In a country where that's a big deal, by the way, and projecting that American strength, those American priorities. As talking about foreign policy, I want to, again, I told you I'm the budget committee, and that's kind of been the big issue of the day in the last week and all. And I want to say a word about that because every issue is a funding issue. Every issue is a budget issue, especially today. Every issue is a fiscal issue. And I often say, I'm 2.5 years here in Congress, and you have lots of constituent groups that come to meet with you to talk about the things that they're concerned about and their policy objectives and the things that the bills they'd like you to support or sponsor or what have you. But I will often tell them that every decision we make has to be made through a fiscal lens. And the fact is, we need to be saying, okay, should we borrow to do this? Should we borrow to do that? You realize we don't have any money. You realize we're running about more than $100 billion deficit every month, over $1 trillion a year. And so I often will say, when you spend recklessly, wastefully, and in many cases harmfully in this administration, meaning things that are actually harming the country, it makes it difficult to fund the things that you should fund, to prioritize the things that you should prioritize. We have $32 trillion in national debt. That equates to about $100,000 per citizen, not per household, not per taxpayer. It's about $250,000 per taxpayer. Think about that astronomical number, $250,000. So how are we to adequately fund our national defense? And the current budget, over $6 trillion, means we're spending about $20,000 per citizen from the federal government. So think about it. Your share of the federal government spending this year is $20,000, $20,000, $20,000. How many of you feel like you're getting your $20,000 share? How much of that $20,000 do you think is going to stuff you want it to go to? And only about $3,000 of that $20,000 is for what I said at the beginning, what's the primary role of the federal government? The safety and security of its citizens, a strong national defense, maybe even a strong border. Not to mention, again, protecting our constitutional liberties. So we spend about $3,000 of that $20,000 on what should be the primary role of the federal government. And as you know, and I see my friend Matt Gaetz, the courageous conservative warrior over there, he and I voted against, as did Dan Bishop, the speaker who was right before me, and I suspect everybody you have today, but we voted against the $4 trillion increase in the national debt that was voted on last week, which will make a default more likely, by the way, and make it that much more difficult for us to fund the priorities of keeping our nation safe. I want to say just a thing or two about the border, and you say, okay, well, this is foreign policy, but 7 million illegals brought across the border, willfully, purposely facilitated by this administration to invade our country. Boy, I was in a hearing yesterday. I don't remember, Peter, if it was budget or ed and workforce. I think it was ed and workforce. And the Dems were freaking out because I was calling it an invasion. It's an invasion of drugs. It's an invasion of human trafficking. And it's an invasion of individuals from 160 different countries. 5.5 million is what Homeland Security basically acknowledges. Homeland Insecurity, I guess I should say. And about 1.5 million of those, 5.5 million who we've encountered, and 1.5 million who are the criminal gotaways. Think about that, by the way. When you come into our country, we give you free health care, free social services, free education, free travel, free housing. No court day to ever appear when you first come in. Who wouldn't want that? And yet there's 1.5 million in the last 2.5 years who didn't want that, who evaded and they didn't come in and surrender. What percentage of that 1.5 million you think might have nefarious intent? Let's say it's only 1%. That's 15,000. What did it take, about 15 to do 9/11? Irreparable, untold harm has been done to this country by this president with the border invasion if we sealed it today. If we sealed it today. And if you're one of the bad guys, why would you conduct your most nefarious activities as long as the border's open and your accomplices are still getting in? It'll be when the border gets sealed, Lord willing, January of 2025, when the border gets sealed. I mean, we're trying before that day, but we've got administration. President deserves to be impeached just because of the border. I would submit that never in the history of the country, never, has our own president done more to intentionally harm the United States than what this president's done with the border. Intentionally. Intentionally. It's on purpose. It is the plan. They're executing the plan. And here we have those, and my time's up, I'm going to stop, but we will have those who want to borrow and spend to defend other nations' borders. When we're we're causing that to happen on the southern border. Well, thanks for letting me be with you today. Thank you again to the American Conservative for having me. Thanks for what you do. And I know you look forward to your next speaker. Thank you.